Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Battleship Bismarck, Part 9. Anxiety to get into our first battle, wrote a 24-year-old petty officer, reached fever pitch, and tension was kept high by numerous rumors that we were about to go into action. By the end of April, Bismarck was provisioned for 3 months at sea. This meant that, among other things, she'd embarked enough pork and beef to feed a city of 250,000 inhabitants for 1 day. On the 28th, Lindemann reported to the Oberkommando der Kriegsmarine, Naval Group North, Naval Group West, and the fleet commander that his ship was fully operational in terms of men and material. In the war diary, he noted, "The crew, from whom it is impossible to keep our approaching departure secret, war correspondents, prize crews, and radio intelligence teams come aboard daily, still does not know that our departure has been postponed. Everyone is working on the final preparations with enthusiastic energy. I fear a considerable setback in morale if the delay is long." Then again, the first stage of the ship's life since her commissioning on August 24th of 1940 has come to a successful conclusion. Our goal has been attained in 8 months, only 14 days more than the original schedule. And that was only because we had to wait in Hamburg for 6 weeks because the Kiel Canal was blocked and ice was creating a problem. The crew can be proud of this feat. It was achieved because the desire to come to grips with the enemy as soon as possible was so strong that I had no hesitance in making extraordinary demands on the crew over long periods of time, and because the ship and her systems suffered no major malfunction or damage despite heavy demands and very little time in port. The level of training is equivalent to that attained by big combatants preparing for the annual battle practice inspection in a good peacetime year. Even though my crew, with few exceptions, has had no combat experience, I have the comforting feeling that with this ship I will be able to accomplish any mission assigned to me. This feeling is strengthened by the fact that, in combination with the level of training achieved, we have, for the first time in years, a ship whose fighting qualities are at least a match for any enemy. The delay in our departure, whose approximate date obviously could not be kept from the crew, is a bitter disappointment to everyone concerned. I will use the waiting time the same way as before to acquire a still higher degree of training, but I will allow the crew more rest and give more time to divisional exercises and the external conditioning of the ship, activities that have understandably had to be severely restricted in recent weeks. The following days were devoted to continuing battle drills, maintenance, and division drills. Statz had his hands full. He inspected the shafts for the engine battle circuits, lubricated the bevel wheel connections, and saw for the first time the little white box with the red letters Procedure V in the pumping room for setting off the scuttling charges if that became necessary. The idea that it would ever have to be used was as remote as the stars. Soon we were so keyed up, the then 24-year-old petty officer wrote later, that we burned to see our first action. The numerous rumors and watchwords of an imminent operation heightened this tension from day to day. It was announced that the fleet staff would embark on Bismarck on May the 12th and conduct a practical test of its collaboration with the ship's command in a clear-for-action drill at sea the following day. The staff numbered approximately 65 men. It consisted of the fleet commander, Admiral Günther Lütjens, his chief of staff, Kapitän zur See Harald Netzband, with whom he had been close friends for years, 3 other senior officers, the fleet engineer, the fleet surgeon, the officer in charge of the radio intelligence, and a few junior officers plus petty officers and men. Then 51 years old, Lütjens was an undemonstrative man, tall and thin, with dark, serious eyes. He joined the Imperial Navy as a cadet in 1907 and first saw the world from the heavy cruiser Freya the same year. After completing the required courses at the Naval School and graduating 20th out of a total of 160 midshipmen in his class, in 1909 he had his first sea duty in a position of responsibility in a big ship. That tour was followed by many years in the sort of training assignments with which he was so repeatedly entrusted, officer training and development of the torpedo boat flotillas. Thus, from 1911 to 1912, he was the officer in charge of naval cadets in the heavy cruiser Hansa. During the First World War, he served in torpedo boats, winding up as a commanding officer and half flotilla leader of the Flanders torpedo boat flotilla. In the years following the war, he commanded torpedo boat flotillas, served on the naval staff in Berlin, and was captain of the Karlsruhe. In the year 1937, as a rear admiral, he became chief torpedo boats. Soon after the Second World War broke out, Lütjens, then a vice admiral, was in command of reconnaissance forces in the North Sea. As a deputy of the fleet commander, he led the covering forces, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, during the invasion of Norway. In July 1940, he assumed command of the fleet and was promoted admiral in September of the same year. In February and March 1941, he gained operational experience, striking at British supply lines in the previously mentioned Atlantic sortie of his flagship Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. This experience proved useful to him in a new operation aboard the mighty Bismarck. Throughout his career, Lütjens was seen by both his superiors and his peers as a highly intelligent, able and courageous man of action. Although his serious, dry disposition and reserve made it difficult for his more outgoing comrades to get close to him, this forbidding exterior concealed a noble and chivalrous character. When he spoke, which he did in a quick and lively manner, it was evident that his thought processes were equally lively. On the morning of May the 13th, the fleet staff conducted the tests on board as had been announced and inspected and tried out the ship's internal communications facilities. One single morning was ample time for that. When at noon the staff disembarked to return to Gotenhafen in the tender Hela, the newcomers among our crew were an experienced richer. They had seen how, just as in times past, a commander led his troops into battle, so now, in the Nelson tradition, the fleet commander would exercise command in action. He would be as close to death as anyone else on board. He would have no more of a rear echelon in which to take refuge than would a corpsman. In many ways it must have seemed to the greenhorns in the crew that their ship belonged less to the world of war than to the world of modern industry. Many of them worked in confined spaces, far from the light of day, their eyes on pressure gauges and indicators, their hands on valves and levers, as they struggled to keep a wandering pointer at the proper place on a dial. Bound to their stations, they would have to manipulate their precision instruments with cool deliberation, even in the heat of battle. Their world was not that of the infantryman, who can release tension during an attack by such satisfying means as firing his rifle. It was a stationary world of highly specialized technology. The hardest test of their physical and psychological endurance, of course, would come in actual combat. By order of the fleet commander, that same afternoon Bismarck again exercised refueling over the bow with Prinz Eugen. Lütjens was particularly concerned that the ships be as perfect as possible at this maneuver because of the circumstances to be anticipated in the operational zone. In the event the enemy should appear when the Bismarck had fuel lines over her bow, she was to be released immediately from the tanker so that she could make her way unhindered. On May the 14th, we carried out reconnaissance and combat evaluations with the light cruiser Leipzig, which was then training in the Gulf of Danzig. The reconnaissance was conducted by our aircraft, whose crews took the opportunity to get in some more practice by attacking one another. In the midst of these exercises, one of the cranes used for hoisting in aircraft suddenly broke down and all practice came to a premature end. Since repair of the crane was urgent and could not be done with the means available on the ship, we went into Gotenhafen, where it was to be offloaded. This was by no means our first experience with a malfunctioning crane. Indeed, in the war diary, Lindemann described our cranes as extremely susceptible to damage and unreliable. He reported this new incident to higher headquarters, adding that he could not yet predict when his ship would be back to a state of operational readiness. In the wardroom, First Officer Oels and the electrical engineer, Korvettenkapitän Wilhelm Freitag, resumed their grumbling about the sorry state of our cranes, but this time the trouble was remedied surprisingly fast. We had gone to all the trouble of offloading oil so that the ship could pass through the shallows at the entrance to Gotenhafen harbor, but it proved unnecessary to remove the crane. A mechanic from the crane's manufacturer came aboard and repaired the damage in about an hour. In the meantime, however, Group North had reacted to Lindemann's message by postponing our departure for Exercise Rhine for at least 3 days. In those beautiful May days of 1941, we were only too glad to be able to spend our 3 hours ashore. We found Gotenhafen rather dreary, however. Originally named Gdynia by the Poles and later called Gdingen by the Prussians, it was a small fishing village until after the First World War, when it was incorporated into Poland and developed into a naval base and commercial port. It had 130,000 inhabitants when in 1939, following the conquest of Poland, the Germans named it Gotenhafen and began to convert it into a major naval base. Being beyond the range of enemy bombers at the outset of the war, it made an ideal base for ships in battle training. We preferred to go to Danzig or to Sopot, which was still closer but, because of wartime conditions, rather deserted. The beach and pier at Sopot invited visits. Both these places were easy to reach by rail, and my good friend Kapitänleutnant Jahreis, nicknamed Seppel, and I spent many happy hours together in one or the other. Bar hopping in Danzig one evening, we were asked by an acquaintance, "When are you going to go?" Of course, we know you can't say. One day you just won't come anymore, and then, maybe, we'll read about you in Wehrmacht reports. Another time, after a tour of the bars in Sopot, we returned to our hotel very late. When we woke up, the sun told us that Bismarck must have long since sailed for her at-sea exercises. Springing out of bed, we made for Gotenhafen with lightning speed. Would we have the undeserved good luck to find a neighborly tug in the harbor? We did. And as we neared Bismarck, which had stopped for us, we saw, standing on the upper deck where we would have to go alongside, a man we had no great desire to see at this very moment. Hans Oehls, the first officer, who was primarily responsible for the discipline on the ship. If at all possible, everyone, whether officer, petty officer or enlisted man, made a huge circuit around Hans Oehls, the unapproachable, whom the crew called the loneliest man on board. This time, with his usual aloofness, he let matters rest by saying, "The captain awaits you on the bridge." "Well," said Lindemann with a kindly smile when we rather sheepishly appeared on the bridge, "go on about your duties." Seppel Jahreis from Oettingen, Bavaria, he loved life and was always cheerful. In those last weeks in Gotenhafen, however, a change came over him. He became unusually quiet and seemed depressed. I had the feeling that a foreboding of what was to come weighed on him. Most of all, however, he suffered, even if he didn't say so, from his sudden and to him incomprehensible transfer from the post of turbine engineer to that of chief of damage control. Since the beginning of the building course, he had become so familiar with his turbines and so humanly close to the turbine crew that the mandatory change tormented him. It was a fateful change. His successor in the engine room survived the sinking of the ship. On May the 1st, the Fleet Command received a telephone call from Hitler's naval aide, Fregattenkapitän Karl Jesko von Puttkamer, advising that the Führer intended to inspect Bismarck and Tirpitz at Gotenhafen on May the 5th. That day, Hitler, Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, von Puttkamer himself, Oberst Nikolaus von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe aide, and the rest of the party arrived on Gotenhafen roads aboard the Hela. Großadmiral Räder was conspicuously absent. The fleet commander conducted the tour of the ship, and the Führer's standard waved over the Bismarck during the 4 hours that Hitler was on board. The crew was mustered on the upper deck in greeting, where Oberbootsmann Kurt Kirchberg had beads of sweat on his forehead from the exertion of cleaning up the last traces of a bucket of paint that had been spilled on the starboard side of the upper deck a moment before Hitler came aboard. Hitler, looking somewhat pale, and Keitel, followed by Lütjens and Lindemann, reviewed the crew. The party then inspected some of the ship's equipment, which gave the responsible officers a chance to brief the Führer in their own areas. Hitler remained for an especially long time in the aft gunnery computer space, where an extremely capable gunfire plotting officer, Oberleutnant zur See Friedrich Kardinal, explained how the various intricate-looking devices controlled gunfire. Keitel as well as Hitler seemed to be much impressed by Kardinal's presentation, but neither asked any questions. After touring the ship, Hitler, Lütjens and a small group adjourned to the Admiral's quarters. There, Lütjens told of his experiences in action against British commerce in the Atlantic with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, expressed optimism about an operation of this type with Bismarck, and explained his immediate intentions. He considered it an advantage that with Bismarck, which was more powerful than the Scharnhorst class, he would no longer be forced to avoid well-protected convoys. This, however, did not solve his most difficult problem: getting his force out into the Atlantic without being spotted by the enemy. When Hitler suggested that, apart from anything else, the numerical superiority of the British fleet presented a great risk, Lütjens pointed to Bismarck's superiority over any single British capital ship. Her hitting and staying power were so great that he had no apprehension on that score. After a pause, he added that breaking out to the high seas would not by any means be the end of our worries. Quite clearly, torpedo planes from British aircraft carriers were a great danger that he would have to reckon with all the time he was in the Atlantic. Little did he know how directly his words bore on the impending fate of his flagship. Apart from his remark about the superiority of the British fleet, Hitler remained silent throughout Lütjens' presentation. This was probably no surprise to Lütjens. He must have been aware that Hitler, who was strictly a landsman, knew nothing whatever about the unique features of war at sea. Whenever the big ships were at sea, Hitler worried that they might be lost, which would be bad enough, and that their loss would damage his prestige, which would be still worse. While he viewed commerce raiding as a deviation from the proper mission of warships, he often assessed its risk more realistically than did the experts. Be that as it may, he remained remote from matters concerning the sea and naval warfare. This characteristic was demonstrated that day aboard Bismarck when Hitler, who was very much interested in military technology, could not find a single word to say about this masterpiece of naval construction and weapon technology. He was not moved to comment. At this time, the Seekriegsleitung was afraid that Hitler might suddenly forbid any ocean operation for Bismarck, a fear it had had in similar cases. Could that have been the reason why Lütjens did not tell Hitler that she was scheduled to sail in 2 weeks' time? Had he and Räder decided to keep quiet about it? Quite possibly so, because Räder did not report the departure of Bismarck and Prince Eugen until May the 22nd, by which time the ships had been at sea for 4 days and were nearing the Denmark Strait, having entered the North Sea long before. Even with the operation that far underway, to get approval for it to continue, he would still have to overcome Hitler's very considerable reservations. The latter, who, as Puttkamer later reported, became extremely nervous following the report of the sailing, immediately responded, "Herr Großadmiral, if at all possible, I would like to recall the ships." Räder objected that the preparations for the operation had already gone too far. No one would understand a recall at this time. The ensuing conversation was ended by Hitler with the words, "Well, perhaps now you have to leave things the way they are, but I have a very bad feeling." No protocol would record these remarks. One would read only, "The Führer agreed." After the presentation in the Admiral's cabin, lunch was served in the wardroom. Hitler's preference for meatless fare being known, it was a vegetarian one-course meal. For security reasons, Hitler was served by an SS man and said hardly anything while he ate. Afterwards, however, he started to talk. It was almost a monologue, only occasional comments came from others. I was seated a long way from the high-ranking people, but from what I could hear, Hitler spoke first about the German minority in Romania. He said that he intended to haul these people back into the Reich in short order if the government in Bucharest did not stop harassing them. On the subject of the United States, he expressed his belief that there was no question of her coming into the war, which, at any rate, would be decided in the Mediterranean. He declared that the Americans remembered the First World War and the unpaid debts of their former allies only too well. They were hardly likely to get themselves involved in another such undertaking and would gladly renounce sacrificing their soldiers in Europe again. Lindemann disagreed with this point of view. He said he was not by any means prepared to write off the possibility that the United States would enter the war. Fregattenkapitän Oels was obviously extremely embarrassed by this contradiction, as it were, of the Führer. Misgiving showed all over his face. At the end of these proceedings, Lütjens stood up and made a brief address. He talked about how the war at sea was going and the tasks that lay before Bismarck. The objective, he said, was and always would be to beat the British wherever they showed themselves. There was no response. After action report time. Tons of foreboding in this episode, with talks of torpedo bombers and the first mention of the scuttling devices. Also, the crew is bursting with anticipation, Lindemann is being a huge bro, and the Führer himself is walking the deck. In the next episode, we will finally get underway to Operation Rheinübung, which is Exercise Rhine, and the fateful mission will commence. I will see you then. Until next time, charm the algorithm by liking, commenting and subscribing. Bye bye. Cheers.